Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for watching and listening to the special simulcast edition of Zoom into Books and the Big Time Talker podcast, sponsored by our friends at speakermatch.com. I'm live in our studios in Washington, D.C., and so happy to talk with author John Brown, who more than 50 years ago was drafted into the Army, and a few minutes later in his mind, he's written books about that time and also his time after the service. The first book is Augies War, and the follow-up novel is Augies World. Augie has an awful lot in common with our author, John H. Brown. And John is also, by the way, a wine and food critic for the Charleston Gazette Daily Mail newspaper and has been for many years. You can visit him online at wordsbyjohnbrown.com. John, thanks for joining us today on the Big Time Talker podcast and Zoom into Books.
Thank you, Burke, for having me, and Kathy also. Look forward to talk to you about my two novels, particularly the latest one, Augies World.
Let's rewind in your mind's eye back to a young John Brown. You were a kid who grew up in small town West Virginia in a very tight-knit Italian-American family. Tell me what life was like as a kid, because that really informs both these books.
Sure. My father was from a small mountain town in West Virginia. Name like Brown, he obviously wasn't Italian, but he met my mother in a town in north central West Virginia, Clarksburg. And after the war, after World War II, he stayed there because in that town there were four glass plants, and he went to work in a glass factory. He turned out to be also the president of his local union for a number of years. So anyway, I grew up with my mother's family. She had 7 other siblings, and I had 20 first cousins, and we all lived on one block in this little portion of Clarksburg called Northview. My grandfather was an immigrant from Calabria, from a town called San Giovanni in Fiore, way down south, and in Italy, and it was a mountain town, and he left there around 1885 or 84. I'm not quite sure what that number is, but in any event, he came to America to work, find a better way of life. Worked in the coal mines in north central West Virginia for about 16 years, and then saved his money, and then built and opened a bakery called Health Bread Company. Well, as a child growing up there with all the Italian influences, I thought I was a full-blooded Italian, because I had no idea that I really didn't have much interaction with my father's side of the family. And consequently, I worked at the bakery, this Italian bakery, from the time I was in 6th grade after school, and then in high school on weekends working overnight. So all of those things influenced me, the Italian love of food, the conversation, conviviality, all of those things that you've probably read bits and pieces of either in other books or in the movies. So that's kind of what got me started thinking about this. And when I went to the West Virginia University and graduated, unfortunately, it was at a time when I could not avoid military service. I was drafted, decided not to go to officers candidate school, so I was an enlisted man, went immediately to Vietnam, and spent a year back then deployed as an awards and decorations writer and somebody who pulled guard duty a lot up in northern South Vietnam.
We're talking with John Brown today. His new book is Augies World, and it's available at Amazon.com, BarnesNoble.com, all over the internet. And you can find out more about John and his books at wordsbyjohnbrown.com. Italian immigrants, really came over in full force through Ellis Island, late 1800s up through the first half of the 20th century. And a lot of them settled in and around the Pittsburgh area, Clarksburg, Fairmont, and a lot of them went into the mining industry and other really tough blue-collar jobs. So you grew up as a blue-collar kid, and yet you talked about working at that Italian bakery all the way through school. you did go away to college. How did you break away from that sort of backbreaking physical labor that your forefathers went through?
Well, I think it goes back to my parents. Both of them, neither one went to college. My father did go to business school for a couple of years, but there was a great emphasis in our family on education. And it turns out that I was the first person in our immediate family to have gone to college. I went to Fairmont State College for 2 years because my parents were afraid of sending me to the larger university till I proved that I would pass and be able to carry on in an academic sort of way. I say sort of way because I really wasn't a great undergraduate student, but I did transfer to West Virginia primarily because I wanted to go into journalism. I wanted to write, and I wanted to. Later on, I decided I probably wanted to cast my future in public relations, and so. But I had to put that on the back burner because when I graduated, to set the stage, and this was in the spring of 1968, a lot of monumental events around the world, particularly in our country, happened between January and July of 1968. I'll just name a couple of them. First off, in late January, early February, we had the Tet Offensive. Up until that point, the Vietnam was more of a distraction, more of a police action. People didn't really take it serious. There were some anti-war demonstrations, but this was the first time that television was involved in documenting the war to such a point that the American public really, got energized to make their voices heard about what they felt about it, and a lot of people didn't like it. So, Tet Offensive. Then I think it was in March, President Johnson, who was up for re-election, decided not to stand for re-election, which shocked a whole bunch of people because Johnson was the person who got us into the war pretty much, or carried it on after Kennedy got us in. And then in April, unfortunately, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. And then about a month and a half after that, Bobby Kennedy was killed. And so during that period, particularly after Dr. King was assassinated, there was rioting in the cities. There were major racial problems, just kind of a little bit kind of like what's happened in the last couple of months here in our country for a whole different reason. But essentially the same kind of thing. People were just tired of this problem. The racism, particularly, that had gone on for a long time in our country. So there's all this racial strife, and that's the background under which I enlisted in the service. All those things happened. So when I go into basic training in the fall of 1968, the world was crazy. Our country was still very, very separated by a lot of anti-war demonstrators on one side, and a lot of the folks who believed that your country is calling you, you got to go and don't ask questions. And so it was really a very interesting time. And I think about when I was in basic training, because I was a college graduate, even though I was an enlisted man, my staff, or my sergeant, drill sergeant, made me kind of a leader. And so I spent a lot of time breaking up fights between blacks and whites, and it was a tough time. And then I get sent to Vietnam as a bonus. So it was an interesting time for me. I think I've lost you, the audio here.
John, I apologize. Yeah. This is Zoom into Books and the Big Time Talker podcast on the Blog Talk Radio Network. John Brown, our guest today. And we're talking about his books. Augies World is the latest. It's the follow-up to Augie's War. And I'm not sure that folks who are watching and listening today can wrap their heads around the fact that here you are, a young guy, less than 20 years old, and you're drafted to go away to war, because we've had selective service for decades now. And I wonder if you can go back in time and think about what that felt like to you to be drafted and in months to be plopped down in an active war zone. Can you remember what that felt like?
Well, I can tell you that I've always been kind of an optimist, and I had to use all of my powers of optimism to think positively that I was going to make it. But I'll tell you, there were, you don't know. I mean, it's just, I'm sure it's the same for anybody who's ever had to go into a war zone. No matter what you do, you're in an area where there's a real good chance you're going to be injured or possibly even killed. So I went there as an optimist, thinking, you know what, I'm probably going to be in a rear area, which I was, fortunately, and I'm probably not going to have I have a better chance than if I was out in the jungle as an infantryman. And as it turns out, that was largely true, except that where I was in a place called Chulai, which is in what they called I Corps, the northern quadrant of South Vietnam. It was a little bit. Our base was the headquarters for the Americal Division, and it was the largest division in the country. But I have to say that it was probably the least effective because of what happened. And I think this goes to a lot of the issues I brought up in Augies War. They kind of gathered people from other units and to make this Americal Division, which is a very storied division in World War II, particularly in the Pacific. Well, they decided they needed a big army presence in northern South Vietnam, and so they asked all of the existing divisions there to give us your best and your brightest. Well, of course, what they did was they gave the Americal Division less than the best and the brightest as our commanders, and we just had a whole lot of people up there, and we were really getting I think pretty well handled by the North Vietnamese, who were our prime, the people we fought against. The Viet Cong were there too, but the North Vietnamese were serious soldiers. And where I stayed, my base got bombarded multiple times a week, usually at night. We'd get sniped at occasionally. So I ended up doing my job, which was to write awards during the day, and then a couple of times a week, sometimes I would be pulling guard duty down on the bunker line, which is the perimeter. So that's how I spent my year. So I was fortunate to be in a rear area on the one hand, but on the other hand, there was really no super safe place to be, particularly in northern South Vietnam then.
I just am imagining you growing up in Clarksburg, West Virginia, in this family, working in a bakery, being a high school kid, going away to college, and then suddenly, bullets are whizzing by. But I do want to ask you about this job that they gave you in the military, because it informed your work as a novelist. Now you have come back many decades later, and you've become a novelist after retiring from your firm. You said you wrote awards and
yes.
decorations. What does that mean exactly?
Well, what would happen was, it's kind of a funny story, and the prime character Augie in the book, a lot of what you write, anybody that writes, particularly the first novel, can't say with any degree of truthfulness that it isn't at least partially autobiographical. So, I was a writer. I was a journalism graduate. I go to Vietnam, and I'm about to be sent out on what they call a landing zone or a hill to fix guns, to fix weapons. If you talk to my wife, she'll tell you that cutting the grass is a mechanical experience for me. But yet they were going to send me out to a landing zone in the middle of the boonies to fix weapons, because I spent 2 weeks learning how to do that out of a 12-week training program. That's how crazy the Army can be at times. So I'm about to be transferred, about to get on a helicopter, and I've got my personnel file, and I'm being checked out. And the fellow who checked me out happened to be from Beckley, West Virginia. And he said, "Oh, you're from West Virginia." And he looked at me and said, "Oh, you're a college graduate." He said, "Why in the hell are you going out to LZ Baldy?" And I looked at him, I said, "Well, is there any place else can I hide here for a while?" He said, "Wait a second." He goes in the back, and it was very fortunate for me because somebody was about to rotate back to the United States, a soldier, and he was a writer. And so the guy comes back, he says, "Look," he said, I see you're a journalist. Can you type? And I looked him right in the face and lied and said, yeah, I'm a great typist. Not, of course, I'm a hunt and peck kind of a typist guy. But that guy probably saved my life. One of many, incidents that happened during that year. But so I get sent up there. And what I did was, what I learned to do, and what I did, I think, rather effectively over time, was we would get a division or a platoon or a company commander who would send in these suggested awards for the folks in their units. And what they would do is they would kind of write out what the incident, what happened, and what the potential awardee did to merit, a Army Commendation Medal, a Bronze Star, a Silver Star, whatever. And so what I would have to do would be to take that information, and there was a standard opening and a standard ending, but I would have to describe in detail what this soldier did to earn this award. And once I did that, then that award would be sent up the line to the division headquarters, and they would ultimately make the decision on what award that the soldier would get. So that's kind of what I did day in and day out. And then the other thing was, we had a large base and a large perimeter, and even the ocean. We were on the South China Sea on one side, and then we were facing the mountains on the other, and there was a big plain in between the mountains and where we were, and that's where a lot of the action happened. So that's kind of what I did. That's I slept with my M16. We had, it was kind of dangerous because you'd have to watch some of your buddies that would get drunk and want to kill the first sergeant. They're carrying, everybody's got weapons. We've got pistols, we've got K-bar knives, we've got hand grenades. We've got magazines full of M16, 223 shells or rounds, and so it was a crazy time.
There's one passage in Augies War, which was the first of these two books. The new one is Augies World from John Brown, that still sticks with me to this day, and that is. And by the way, I should tell folks, I'm not only the interviewer, I'm a fan of John's work. His books are fantastic, and they're fictional novels, but they're based in truth. And you can find out more at wordsbyjohnbrown.com. The books are available at Amazon and Barnes & Noble. But there's one passage in there, John, where you're just in the thick of it, in Vietnam, and bullets are whizzing past, and you're essentially running for your life, and you get a few days R&R, and you're sort of shoved onto a plane, shell-shocked, and, in a few hours, you land in Australia, and it's like you're in a whole different world.
Yeah.
And it was just amazing when Augie and his buddy sort of land there, and then everything is fine, and it's like you have a normal life, but then there's the dread knowing that in just a few days, you're going to have to go right back into that hell that was Vietnam. And I wonder if that actually happened to you, or if that's something you just put into the book from a fictional standpoint.
No, that happened. And what a lot of us did over there was you could take, the Army would give you 1 week leave. You could take that at any of these kind of R&R locations, and 1 week of R&R. So you could have 2 weeks off at some point during the year. A lot of people who were married, a lot of guys who were married, would meet their wives in Hawaii or someplace like that, which was halfway between Vietnam and the U.S. kind of. But we saved, my buddy and I saved our time. I got there in late, I guess it was early March, and so I had to stay till early March of the next year. So we went on R&R to Sydney in December. So when I came back, I would only have 2.5 months left. But you're right, it's surreal. One minute I'm kind of ducking and worrying, and I get on a helicopter, and they fly me down to Cam Ranh Bay, which is a huge base, Army and Air Force base in Vietnam. And then within an overnight, we'd get a chance to clean up, and our parents usually would send us some civvy clothes. And of course, the military would give us, because our jungle fatigues were falling off of us. So we had clothes, and all of a sudden we're putting on real clothes, stateside clothes. We're on an airplane, and it's 8 hours, and we're landing in Sydney, Australia. And it's just like, what happened here? You can't. It's just almost like it's a miracle. But I must say that the thing that impressed me about Sydney, and that's the Opera House had just been completed. So it was a beautiful place, and we did take the opportunity to get into the harbor, and of course, we drank our weight in beer and other things, and did a lot of those kind of things. But the thing that impressed me about Australia more than anything else was how wonderful the residents of Australia that we met were. They really supported us, supported the war, so unlike what we would later experience when we went back to the U.S., where, you hear about people getting spit on. I mean, I've had things thrown at me. When I got back, I had some time to pull, and I worked in downtown Pittsburgh, and I'd park across the river, and I'd walk across the 10th Street Bridge with my uniform on. I don't know how. I mean, it was miserable. Finally, it got to the point so bad that they would allow us to wear our civilian clothes until we got into the federal building. This was where this was, and then we could change into our Army clothes. So, backing up, Australia, the people were so friendly. They appreciated what we were doing, and when you think about it, geographically, they're a heck of a lot closer. They were a heck of a lot closer to Vietnam. And if you believed in the domino theory, where the communists would just go from one place to another, who knew how long it would be before they'd be in Australia? I mean, I think that was probably the conventional wisdom of the time. But in any event, I remember if I ever came close to deserting, it was right before I had to get back on that airplane and go back to Vietnam. So different. It was a different time. It was just a totally different time. And so that's how when I got back from there, I read a lot. So I had read Catch-22 a number of times. I love that book by Joseph Heller about the insanity of war, and I saw it firsthand. Truth is stranger than fiction. A lot of the stuff that I wrote about, some of it's really outlandish and didn't happen, but things like that happened that I write about on Augies War, and some of the stuff you can't make up.
John Brown is our guest today on this special simulcast edition of Zoom into Books and the Big Time Talker podcast. Check him out online at wordsbyjohnbrown.com. And the new book is Augies World. Unlike a lot of folks that write about their military service, this is something that you sort of put in the background, in the recesses of your mind, you told me, and you didn't think a lot about it for a long time. You went on to a very successful career, serving, very high levels in state government as a commissioner there, ran a very successful firm. But when it came time for retirement, you went back to look at that world. And in this new book, Augies World, Augie, the main character, who has a lot of similarities to you, dealt with what today we call PTSD. That really wasn't a thing in the early 70s that you talked about. And I wonder, when you look back on that, is that what happened to you? Did you come back? I remember back in those days, they would say that guys came back shell-shocked. Were you one of those shell-shocked kids that came back and had to try to...
You know what? I never thought so. I did have dreams, crazy dreams. I still have about one a year where I'm an old man now, and for some reason they're sending me back to Vietnam, and I can't understand why. But I mean, I'm so fortunate compared to other people. So, the worst part of it for me was being ashamed that I served over there because of the way people made me feel. I went to graduate school, and when they found out I was a Vietnam vet, a lot of people treated me really poorly. That was, I went to graduate school the spring of 1970, 1991, I think it was. Well, it was right before Kent State. And so it was a fever pitch in terms of anti-war. So it was the wrong place to be for a guy like me in graduate school. I made it through, got out of there, but it was crazy. And, PTSD, I devote the book to people who have been in any war, anywhere, any country, because, and particularly those who are afflicted by PTSD. And what I say on the cover of the book is that PTSD was not declared a condition until about 10 years after Vietnam, largely because there were so many people coming back from Vietnam, so many soldiers and Marines and naval personnel, Air Force guys who really had these issues. And, they finally decided that there obviously was some kind of psychological malady that associated with this, all of these kinds of, all of these people coming back so messed up psychologically and emotionally. And so they finally gave it a name. But when I came back, it was still shell shock or, Johnny's got a problem, or, it was really all of these kind of derogatory, I'd even call them pejorative terms for people who served and had issues. And you almost felt like a coward if you had them. I didn't think I had them. I had a friend of mine who I sent my novel to, Augies World, before I sent it out because he was a Vietnam vet. And he was out on the boonies, and he kind of psychoanalyzed me. He was one of those kind of guys. He said, maybe you're writing this because it's cathartic, because you're expiating demons, you're getting rid of it. And I never really thought of it that way, but maybe there's an element of that. I certainly was I can't say it loud enough and long enough. I was certainly very fortunate compared to a lot of my comrades who were out in the jungles, really having it a lot worse than I did. So, but anyway, what I wanted to do in this book was to talk about how important it is that we pay attention to people that have these issues when they come back from wars. And I'm more concerned than I was back then about what's going on now with the All Volunteer Army, where we have these young kids going back, not one time or two times, 3 times and 4 times, and the psychological toll that it's got to be taken on these people. I don't care where you are. If you're in a war zone, you don't need to go back multiple times, but maybe if you're going to be a career military person. So I worry about that. But when I got back the first time, again, I was in graduate school. I had some free time. I liked to write, and I started writing this novel, Augies War. I got about 2 or 3 chapters into it, got married, had children, put it on the back burner until I retired about 3 or 4 years ago. And I, I'm a wine writer, so I have to sample good wine and occasional food, or maybe a lot of food and a lot of wine. And my wife said, kind of half jokingly, you can't start drinking wine at 8 o'clock in the morning. So that kind of, she said, why don't you write that book you've always wanted to write? And so that's what happened. I started writing it, and was fortunate enough to find someone who wanted to publish it, Black Rose Writing. And when I finished that book, people seemed to like it. And I thought, well, it lends itself to some kind of a sequel. I didn't want to call it a sequel because I don't think you have to have read Augies War to understand Augie's World and appreciate what Augie went through when he was in the war. But that's how that was my thought process in writing the Augie's World. Augie back in the world. The world is what we, in the service, particularly in Vietnam, would call the United States the world.
The rest of the world outside Vietnam. John Brown, our guest today. The new book is Augies World. The first book, Augies War. They're both available at wordsbyjohnbrown.com, amazon.com, barnesandnoble.com, wherever great books are sold. I want to talk to you, if we can, a little bit about the craft of writing, because many times other authors or folks that want to be authors listen to our Time Talker podcast, or they watch Zoom into Books. You said you started the first book some 50 years ago, put it away, but in your professional life, you did some writing. You did some advertising writing, some marketing writing. How is that writing from a sort of technical sense different than writing a novel?
You know what? I think it's all very helpful to write, no matter what the style is that you're writing, whatever whether it's journalism, it's you know, you're an English teacher and you're trying to write a novel on the side. I think the biggest, and I always laughingly told people, you know, I wrote these wine columns from 1980 on, still writing about wine and food, is that I was trying to keep sharp in training to write a novel, and that was really more true than not, because I always did want to do it. But there is a distinct difference between writing for journalism and writing literature, whether it's nonfiction. More so, nonfiction is a little more like journalistic writing, but certainly literary fiction is totally different in this respect. If you know, I got a C from Professor Atkins, the Flying A, and people, that's what we call them at WVU. And that was the hardest C that I ever got in my life. And I felt really good getting it because this guy was tough. But one of the things they teach you is to write the inverted pyramid style. That is, you know, you want to put as much information in the first paragraph and then get all that stuff, the who, what, where, when, and why, right away. And then you can't, they really discourage you, even if you're writing an editorial, from using flowery terms or going into great explanations. So the way they teach you to write in journalism is to write very concise report on what happened and get over it. So that's the way I kind of wrote. Even if was writing a press release, you didn't want to go too far afield. So you wanted to get it maybe in one page, or you wanted to make it short enough to have an impact, and you wanted to have the lead be really important. And so you wanted to put emphasis on that, just the facts, man. So, but then when you start writing, I think I've kind of transitioned a little bit, morphed a little bit from the first book to the second in terms of my ability to explain things a little more in detail, but I still feel guilty about doing it. I mean, my books they're 250 pages or less. And you know, I see all these writers that write 450, 500 word novels, and I'm thinking, man, you know, how do you do that? Or why do you do that? But I think there's a time and place for everything. My novels, I think that, again, I think I've grown a little bit in terms of maybe describing things a little bit more in detail, but I still have that journalistic bent, is to stick to a storyline and try to make sure that I don't go too far afield and lose readers, you know, go off on a tangent, and all of a sudden, you know, you're turning pages, just whipping through to get back to find out what really happened. So I don't know. I think everybody is different. I will say that it's not the easiest thing I've ever done to write. And the only advice I can give people who want to do that, who want to write, is to sit down and start. And so many times I'm thinking, what am I going to write about? Even in the middle of writing this latest novel, I don't have any inspiration. What am I going to do here? And somehow, for me, if I sit there long enough and I start writing, it becomes more clear, and I find a path to get to the next chapter or to the next paragraph even. So I think once you decide that you want to do it, you can't be deterred by what you might call writer's block. You almost have to I have to force myself to sit down and begin to write, because once I do that, inevitably, I'll find something there that I can use. It might just be a paragraph. It might be a sentence. It could be 2 pages, which is a lot to write in one day, I think. So everybody will have to find their own way of doing it, but that's kind of the way that works for me.
The new book is Augies World. The author is John Brown. The website, wordsbyjohnbrown.com. We've got a listener comment that I wanted to pass along to you, John. And
Sure.
she says, I was in college at the time. Mr. Brown is right. The Vietnam vets were loners and seemed to be antisocial. The mood on campus was bad, and then Kent State happened. His service is greatly appreciated. I'm glad he wrote these books. And that leads me to ask you another question, and that is this. They say you write about what you know. In your first book, you touched on your service in Vietnam. The new book, Augies World, you talk about sort of those invisible scars of war that your lead character, Augie Compton, goes through, but also helping his family overcome a threat from organized crime from the mob. Now, that's very stereotypical. You see it in movies, you read it in books all the time, but the organized crime influence in Italian-American families, especially during that time, you think about The Godfather, you think about Goodfellas. Was there a mob influence in that town in West Virginia? What can you tell me about the reality of writing about what you know and your interaction with the mob back then?
Well, I can answer it. Nothing is a quick and easy answer, but here's the way I would frame that. I did a lot of research, and thank goodness I didn't have to go to the library. I mean, I hated to go to the library. I loved to go to the library for what I wanted to go to the library for. That was to look through World War II magazines and things that interested me and find books, which I like to read. But I didn't really want to go there to do academic research. But so when the internet really got revved up, you can find just about anything. So I did a lot of research on my own hometown, Clarksburg, and what might have prompted this kind of divide between the Italian community and also other ethnic communities and the people with names like Brown, who may have run things. And I thought, boy, there seemed to be a lot of prejudice when I was growing up from people with Smith and Brown as last name. You'd hear it. It was kind of an undercurrent. There were actually certain places in the town that if you were Italian, you could not buy a home. Parts of Clarksburg. And I'm in high school and in college, and that's the way it was. It was the same for Jewish people and certainly Black people and immigrant folks. And I could never figure. I said, boy, it's just really so cruel. What is going on? Well, apparently, like in a lot of places in the United States, when we had this vast immigration from Italy and other places to the United States going through Ellis Island, you saw the Godfather and all the things that happened, in the Italian communities where they would, these immigrants were hardworking people and God-fearing people, but they were sometimes the victims of some of this anti-immigrant sentiment that we see even now. And so these criminals would offer them protection. And that happened not only there, it happened in New York City, it happened in Pittsburgh, it happened in all the big cities. Well, in Clarksburg, which is about 2 hours by road or hour and 45 minutes from Pittsburgh, back in those days, if there was a place to go, a pool room where you could gamble, there was always a tie somehow to somebody at another place, particularly if it was an Italian place, that to permit them to allow you to bet on a baseball game or whatever. I knew that was going on, but I didn't really kind of know that there really was a direct line. And in some research that I did, I found out that in 1924, this group called La Familia Vagabonda, which I refer to in the book, existed in Clarksburg. It actually from 1915 to 1930. And they were, as long as they limited their activities to the Italian community, the police didn't care. I don't know whether they were paying the police off. I suspect they were, left them alone. But if they engaged in any violent activity among themselves or with God forbid, anybody with the Smith or Brown name, then they would come down on them. And what happened was these La Familia Vagabonda guys, and we'll just call them the mob or the Black Hand, they murdered one of their own fellow criminals. And the police came down on them big time, the state cops, everybody, and they ended up hanging 6 of them in Moundsville, 1924, I think. So, I mean, there's a history of those kind of organizations, and it gives the vast majority of Italian folks a bad name. And of course, it's easy. Everybody will just say, well, you know, if you're Italian, you must be in the mob, which is total BS. But there is a legacy of the Black Hand, the mafia, whatever, in running through the culture of the United States. Maybe not so much now as back then, but even in the 70s, there was a little bit, may have been a dotted line from Clarksburg to Pittsburgh, but Clarksburg was, to the extent it had some control by the mafia or the Black Hand or La Familia Vagabonda, it was Pittsburgh. So a lot of the stuff that I write about, most of the stuff that I write about has some basis in fact. Now, you know, the rest of it, a lot of the stuff I've exaggerated. But, you know, I talk about in Augies World, not just Jeweltown, which is kind of, everybody says, well, that must be Clarksburg. Well, maybe it is. But I talk about Canaan Valley. I talk about Dolly Sogs. I talk about other places that people, if they're from this area or even the region, will understand. Will always say, oh, yeah, okay, I know that. Because I wanted this to have a little bit more of a feel of authenticity. I wasn't trying to, you know, hide the names, proper names of institutions and cities and places like that.
John Brown, our guest today. The new book is Augies World, and yes, there's some interesting historical nuggets in there, but most importantly, John writes page turners. These are books that are fun to read, and they suck you in from beginning to end. Part of the first book and the second book center around this Italian bakery that you actually grew up in and around, and there's a legendary Italian thing that is available primarily in West Virginia. When I lived out in the West Coast, people had no idea what it was, the pepperoni roll. So what can you tell me about the pepperoni roll from your childhood? Was that a thing back then?
Oh, yeah. You know, there are these big arguments to this day about who really invented it. There's a bakery in I guess in Fairmont, Country Club Bakery. Doesn't sound like an Italian bakery, but it is, who claims that they are the ones that invented it. But, you know, Health Bread Company, my grandfather's place, they thought they were the ones that did it. And then Tomorrow's Bakery in Clarksburg. There are like 4 Italian bakeries in the region. But, yeah, pepperoni rolls, I knew about them firsthand, and I mean that literally, because I used to sack those babies, you know, at 2 o'clock in the morning, hot pepperoni rolls into paper bags. And then when I was working at the bakery, and then about 2 or 2:30, all these drunks would descend, you know, to get their couple of pepperoni rolls before they stumbled off to bed. So yeah, I mean, there were a lot of, that's where I come up with a lot of the characters. I mean, a lot of them are true to form. I mean, these are real people, or composites of real people that I ran into as a kid growing up. I mean, there's a lot about the pool room, the Rough Avenue pool room in both places. You know, it's a gathering place. There's some characters I think that people will kind of laugh at and wonder, are these people real? Like people that owned bars, you know, guys that built mannequins, you know, kind of interesting, I think interesting characters. I mean, I get a kick out of them. Somebody said, well, why do you write about stuff like that? And I said, you know what? I write a lot about dark things. And there's a lot of pain and agony in some of the things I write. I said, I get depressed reading what I write. So I kind of analyze my writing. And I said, the reason I do that, and I think it's partially true, is I like to write about things that make me laugh. You know, I've got a weird sense of humor, granted, but so I'll write these lighter things and intersperse them with some of the darker things that happen, because that's the way life is anyway. I mean, it isn't one, you're not going in one direction, God forbid, all the time. Nobody's going straight up or straight. You know, there's a lot of bumps in the road, but a lot of those bumps are humorous. They're incidents. There are people that you met that are pretty unique. And then when you think back on it, you say, man, I know that guy? I mean, did they really do that? And then, of course, you can add a little bit to it. But I think I'm a product of a wonderful family. The other thing, and I do want to say this, is I've dedicated this book to my family too, and to all families really. But the Italian American families in this country are largely alike. I don't care where they're from. In Italy, generally speaking, they're very close knit. They've got each other's back. There's wonderful food. I mean, my family, and I write a lot about food in this book, and there's even recipes at the end of it that I attribute to the fictional characters that people grew up with, that my family made these things. So I wanted to highlight the importance of family and how family helps Augie get through these things. And if it wasn't for them, he wouldn't have been able to in both books because they provided the crutch for him in Vietnam. As he could flash back and think about these things when times were bad. And then when he comes back and he's suffering these invisible scars and wounds, he has his family to fall back on, and they've got his back. So, this is important to me to write about the influence, the positive influence, and how important family is, as it was to talk about the actual story itself.
These books both move really, really well, and I think that's a testament to the editing process. So let's talk about your first editor and your biggest critic, and what kind of feedback you get from that individual. Well,
kind of laugh at my daily editor was my wife every day, and she was a school teacher, so she's a very good writer herself, but she is, talk about long suffering. Every day that I write, she'd look at it and she would correct it. And I had other friends. I mean, on this book, I had 3 people, we call them beta readers, read the manuscript from time to time and give me pointers. And it was very, very helpful. I even hired a fellow once I thought that we were in a good shape to look at it from, not so much from a word by word, do I have a period there, but content. So a lot goes into it, and I can't imagine on my own, even though I think I might have spell check, I think I know where things, I know a lot about punctuation and all that kind of stuff. I would never, ever attempt to write a book without having a bunch of different people help me edit it. But my wife is my daily editor, so she would, she'd level with me if she didn't like something. And she would spot things that I thought that were right, but they weren't. So editing is a huge and a pain in the butt, but it's really essential. I mean, not only from the standpoint of moving things on and continuity, but also, if you have a lot of mistakes, and I found 2 or 3 many things that once this one was published, it drives me crazy. But it's just, it's very unprofessional to see a lot of that, I guess.
You talked about long suffering. How long have you and your wife been together?
We just celebrated our 50th anniversary. It's hard to believe. I don't know how I put up with her. I mean, I better not say that. 50 years. 50 years. It's a long time, isn't it? You know what? The time flies, like for everybody else, and we've been very fortunate. We have 2 grown sons and 3 grandchildren that we love dearly. And in this crazy time we're in now, we can't see them as much as we'd like. But it's a good time to read, though, isn't it? I mean, it's kind of a good time to open up a book. And I certainly have. I mean, I've always got 2 or 3 things going, that I'm reading. Just finished a book called Enemy at the Gates. Some of you may know about it. It was actually a Pulitzer Prize winner in 1968 book, a Pulitzer Prize winning book, and it was about the Battle of Stalingrad, which is an incredible book. Then I read kind of trashy things like, not trashy, but I love Elmore Leonard. He's gone now, but I've read everything that he's written. Crime stuff. Robert Cray, C-R-A-I-S. If you get a chance and you like crime stuff, I love him, and I read everything that he has. So I always have 2 or 3 things going, and it keeps me stimulated. I see how well these people write, and kind of encourages me to try to improve what I do. But I've always loved to read.
You've given us some really good tips on the writing process when it comes to editing and reading other authors. And as we begin to wrap up, I want to ask you about the new book and I guess both books. What is it you're most proud of in Augies World and Augie's War? I mean, I think you've got to be proud just that you finished that first book after all that time. But what are you most proud of in those 2 books?
You know what? I honestly can't. I think the fact that, and maybe I'm just listening to the wrong people, but both books have, so far, the first book was well received. And it makes me feel like, well, then maybe I accomplished something, because I wanted to make a novel that, was something that people would not forget. So I don't know I think the fact that I finished them, that was writing the first one. Everybody said, well, how'd you write that book? And so I felt good about that. But when the reaction to the book was positive, that was probably the biggest feeling of having done something right. I mean, still, I go back and look at it, and I wish I would have done this or different or that different. And the same thing with Augies World. I'm still on pins and needles, although the book has gotten 2 really good reviews, one from Kirkus Reviews, which is a pretty prestigious national reviewing group. So I feel pretty good about that, but I'm still waiting to see what friends and family and other folks have to say about this book. It's only been out less than a month.
The book is Augies World. That's the new one from John H. Brown. It's the follow-up to Augie's War, and you can find them both at wordsbyjohnbrown.com and Amazon, Barnes & Noble, wherever books are sold. Congratulations on the new book. Was the second one easier than the first one? Had you figured it all out by the time you got around to writing number 2?
I don't think so. I mean, I think it was actually more difficult to get started. It took me 10 months to start the second book. After the first one was published, and I just didn't know what I was going to write it, whether I should write it. But there was so much more to write about Augie, and who knows? I keep getting asked, "Am I going to write Augie 3?" And I didn't want to do that. But the more I think about it, I kind of miss the character, and I miss it. So I'm kind of leaning towards trying to do that. Although I really want to branch out and do something else. But I think there's still more of a story to tell. And I don't want to give too much away, but you've read it. So I think there's room to do something else. I'm hoping I'll be able to get the inspiration to start.
Well, we hope so too. We love the character. We love the books. And you can always get periodic updates on John's writing as a food and wine critic for the Charleston Gazette newspaper. Those columns are online. He's been doing that now for decades as well. John Brown, thanks for the conversation. Thanks for being here. Best of luck with Augie's World.
Really appreciate you doing this, and we'll see where it goes. But thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk about them.
It's our pleasure. Thanks as well to Kathy Tietz and the gang at Headline Books and Zoom Into Books for the Blog Talk Radio Network and our Big Time Talker podcast, sponsored by Speaker Match. I'm Burke Allen. Thank you so much for being here. Now go out and make it a great day.